Sarah King opened her eyes to the soft morning light filtering through the semi-transparent curtains of her small living room. The air was filled with the familiar aroma of freshly ground coffee, which she always prepared the night before, so that in the morning she only had to press a button. Next to the sofa where she preferred to fall asleep stood her wheelchair, in which she spent most of her life after Afghanistan. She slowly stretched, transferring her body into the wheelchair with the skill honed over the years. Her movements were precise and measured, but the feeling of fatigue remained. She wheeled herself to the kitchen, poured a cup of coffee, then settled by the window with her laptop, scrolling through the news and social media. She tried not to dwell on the past, but it haunted her everywhere, especially on quiet mornings. Long service, deployments to hotspots, the last patrol in Afghanistan, a convoy moving down a desert road, sunlight glinting off the armor of the vehicles. Then, an explosion, a powerful impact, the sound of tearing metal, blinding light, and then darkness, pain, hospitals, and the final verdict. You will never walk again. Taking another sip of coffee, Sarah shifted her gaze to the street and froze. Across the road stood a silver car with the HOA logo on the windshield. Her heart tightened. She had seen this car before. Karen Holloway, the chairwoman of the Homeowners Association, got out of the car holding a notepad. The woman was intently examining the house and then made a few notes. Sarah frowned and opened the door. "Good morning," Karen looked up with a smile devoid of warmth. "Good morning," Sarah remained calm. "I'm just checking the details. I'm sure you understand. We have to ensure compliance with the neighborhood standards." Sarah gripped the wheel tighter. "As long as it doesn't interfere with my routine, there's no problem." Karen nodded, but her gaze slid to the ramp attached to Sarah's house. "The ramp. Are you sure it was approved by the HOA?" "The city authorities approved it. I have all the documents." Karen folded her arms across her chest. "I understand, but we have special requirements here. We'll be having a meeting soon. You should attend." When Karen left, Sarah sat motionless for a few more minutes, watching her car drive away. Something inside her told her this was just the beginning. In the evening, returning from work, Sarah noticed an official envelope in her mailbox. Dropping her bag on the floor, she tore it open with trembling fingers and quickly scanned the printed text. Each word imprinted itself in her mind, making her heart tighten even more. "Your ramp does not comply with the residential complex standards. You are given 14 days to rectify the noncompliance." Her fingers gripped the edge of the paper tighter. She reread the text again and again, but the essence did not change. They were forcing her to remove the ramp. She took a deep breath, but the lump in her throat did not disappear. This ramp was her only connection to the outside world. Without it, she would simply be trapped in her own home. Didn't they understand this, or simply didn't want to? Leaving the letter on the kitchen table, Sarah turned on her laptop. Her fingers nervously tapped on the keyboard. She searched for information on accessibility laws, browsed legal websites, and scrolled through forums where people with disabilities discuss their problems. Articles, court decisions, comments from lawyers, all of this blended into a single stream of information. A glimmer of hope sparked in her mind. Maybe she could find a loophole? A way to challenge this absurd decision? She opened her email and began writing letters to her acquaintances, lawyers and activists fighting for the rights of people with disabilities. She knew the response wouldn't come immediately, but at least it felt like action, like a step forward, not just helplessly watching her independence crumble. When night fell over the city, Sarah tried to go to bed. She closed her eyes, but sleep did not come. Thoughts raced in her head, giving her no peace. If they demolished the ramp, what would she do? How would she get out of the house? In her memory, that day when the doctor in the hospital handed her the verdict that shattered her former life resurfaced. You will never walk again. In her dream, she was back in Afghanistan. Her convoy was moving down the road, the sun reflected in the dusty sand, and then there was an explosion. Metal screeched, vehicles overturned, and her ears rang. She tried to move, but her body wouldn't listen. Suddenly, everything froze, and through the smoke, she heard Karen's cold, detached voice. "Your ramp does not comply with the standards." Sarah screamed and woke up, covered in cold sweat. The room was dark. The silence felt oppressive. She took a deep breath, trying to pull herself together. She had to do something. She had to act. Sarah picked up her phone, turned on the front camera, and hit the record button. Her voice trembled, but she spoke firmly. She told her story, about how she served, about how the explosion changed her life forever, about how the HOA was trying to take away the one thing that allowed her to live with dignity. Finishing, she looked at the screen for a long time, then posted the video online. She didn't know what reaction it would provoke, but it was her first step in the fight. The next morning, Sarah heard noise outside. She looked out the window and saw workers in reflective vests gathered around her ramp. Karen Holloway stood nearby, clutching a tablet and giving orders. Sarah's heart sank. She realized this was the moment she had feared. She wheeled herself onto the porch and asked, "What's going on here?" Karen looked at her with feigned regret. "The ramp does not comply with HOA rules. We have to demolish it." Sarah felt anger boiling inside her. She grabbed her phone, turning on the camera. "You have no right." But the workers had already started dismantling her only way out. Sarah clenched her teeth, feeling the anger growing inside her. She knew she couldn't just stand by. Grabbing her phone, she began filming the scene, pointing the camera directly at the workers and Karen. Her voice trembled with indignation. "You have no right to do this. I submitted all the documents, and this ramp was approved." Karen turned to her with the same cold, expressionless look. "The decision has been made, Ms. King. You should have attended the HOA meeting to contest it." Sarah felt her breath catch. "This is illegal. You have no right to deny me access to my home." Some neighbors looked out of their homes watching the scene. Someone took off their hood and clenched their fists. Someone held a phone recording. They weren't intervening, but Sarah could feel their gazes. She wasn't sure if it was sympathy or just curiosity. One of the workers, a tall, middle-aged man, paused for a moment and looked at her with a shadow of doubt in his eyes. "I'm sorry, ma'am, but we have orders." Sarah tried to hold back tears. "You don't understand. If you remove this ramp, I won't be able to leave the house. Is that right? Is that how you treat people?" The man hesitated. Karen noticed this and stepped forward, her voice firming up. "Continue the work." The screech of metal and the crack of breaking wooden boards filled the air. The ramp was collapsing. Sarah gripped the armrests of her chair so tightly her knuckles turned white. Marley, her dog, growled, sensing his owner's distress. Her heart pounded in her chest. She felt helpless. But at that moment, when everything seemed irretrievably lost, a voice rang out from the other side of the street. "Hey, leave her alone!" The voice belonged to Greg Parker, her neighbor, a burly man with a stern expression. He took a few steps forward, and others followed. Sarah looked at them with hope. Maybe she wasn't as alone in this fight as she thought. Sarah sat on her porch, her heart still racing from the ordeal. The ramp was destroyed, her connection to the outside world gone. But more than the loss, she was shaken by a sense of betrayal. How could a system she had defended in service turn its back on her like this? Greg Parker and a few other neighbors stopped by her house. They exchanged glances, and the air was thick with silence. Greg was the first to break it. "This isn't fair, Sarah. We can't let them treat you like this." She swallowed, trying to hold back her emotions. Her fingers tightened on the armrests of her chair. "They think they can just take away my freedom. But I won't give up." Lisa Clark, her former colleague, called her a few minutes after the ramp was destroyed. She had seen the video Sarah recorded the night before and had already spread it among other veterans. "Sarah, you're not alone. We'll make sure people know what's happening. I've sent your video to several veteran organizations. Support is already coming." Sarah clutched the phone, her breathing deepening. Her story was spreading beyond this small neighborhood. She was no longer a victim. She was becoming a voice of resistance. Within a few hours, the video went viral on social media, and Sarah began receiving dozens of messages. People were outraged by the HOA's actions, expressing words of support, and some even offered legal help. Several veterans living nearby promised to come. They couldn't stand by and do nothing. Later that evening, a group of about a dozen people gathered in Sarah's yard. Veterans, neighbors, even strangers who had heard about the situation. They weren't there just to show support. They wanted to help. Greg unfolded an old folding table and placed a notepad on it. "We need a plan. First, we find a lawyer. Second, we go to the press. Third, we build a new ramp, this time so they can't demolish it. Sarah looked at the people around her, feeling a surge of determination. She was no longer alone. They thought they could break me, but they just pissed off the wrong person, she said, crossing her arms. We'll do this. Together. The next morning, Sarah woke up to the sound of noise outside. She rubbed her eyes and cautiously approached the window. In the driveway, several cars and pickup trucks were already parked, their bumpers adorned with military stickers. People were getting out of the vehicles, talking to each other, some holding up their phones, recording the scene. She didn't immediately realize that these were veterans. Dozens of former military personnel, men and women of all ages, had come to support her. Sarah couldn't believe her eyes. Coming out onto the porch, she noticed a familiar figure, Lisa Clark. Lisa approached first, smiling. "You didn't think we'd leave you alone, did you?" she said, hugging Sarah tightly. Sarah took a deep breath. Inside, everything was trembling with overwhelming emotions. She looked at the people who had come for her. This was more than she could have imagined. Greg Parker was already on the scene. He was setting up folding chairs, preparing for an impromptu meeting. Next to him stood a tall man with graying hair, Master Sergeant Bill Raines, a veteran with an impeccable reputation. "We heard your story, Sarah," he said, shaking her hand, "and we're here for a reason. We won't let you be treated unfairly." Sarah was stunned. Lisa nudged her forward. "Tell everyone what happened," she said. Sarah gripped the armrests of her chair and looked at those gathered. She remembered the moment when she recorded the video, but then she was speaking into the void. Now real people stood before her, ready to fight alongside her. "They demolished my ramp," she began, forcing herself to speak calmly, though inside she was boiling. "They decided they could just erase me from the life of this neighborhood, as if I didn't exist. But I'm here, and I won't let them take away my right to live." Someone in the crowd nodded. A young veteran with an amputated leg raised his hand. "We'll build a new one," he said firmly, "and this time so that no one can demolish it." The crowd murmured in agreement. Someone shouted approvingly. Bill Raines raised his hand, restoring order. "First, we need a lawyer," he said. "We need to find any legal leverage we have. Lisa, can you handle that?" Lisa nodded. "I have connections. I've already sent a request to the veteran organization. I think we'll find a specialist by evening." Greg added, "And in the meantime, we'll build. We have tools, materials, people. We won't let them take away your access to your home again." Sarah couldn't hold back a smile. She felt her heart filling with gratitude. Just a day ago, she was broken, and now an army of supporters surrounded her. Work began. The veterans organized themselves. Someone brought tools. Someone took care of calculations. While the new ramp was being built, Sarah saw that even other neighbors were joining in. Mrs. Parker brought coffee. Mr. Rodriguez helped cut wood. People who had merely watched yesterday were now participating. Soon, reporters arrived. Several correspondents began recording interviews, filming the scene. Sarah gave a comment, her voice confident. "This isn't just about me," she said. "It's about all of us, about everyone who has faced injustice and refused to give up." By evening, the new ramp was almost ready. It was stronger, more reliable than the old one. Bill Raines inspected the structure and nodded approvingly. "Now give it a try," he said. Sarah cautiously wheeled to the beginning of the ramp, took a breath, and pressed the joystick. The chair smoothly ascended, effortlessly. At the top, she stopped and looked at everyone. "Thank you," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. "Thank you all." The crowd applauded. At that moment, Sarah realized that this fight was no longer just hers. It had become a symbol of resistance. But she knew this wasn't the end yet. The next morning, Sarah woke up early. The sky was gray, promising rain, but the air was filled with a sense of inevitability. Her new ramp was strong, reliable, but the battle was not yet over. Notifications poured in, one after another on her phone. Dozens of comments, reposts, messages of support. The story had spread further than she could have imagined. Local news agencies had already published articles, and even several national outlets had interviewed Lisa. Everything indicated that the situation had gone beyond their small neighborhood. Sarah scrolled through the feed when one of the messages caught her attention. It was an official response from an HOA representative. They demanded the immediate dismantling of the ramp, insisting that it was built without permission, and threatened large fines. Her hands clenched into fists. They weren't going to stop. She called Lisa. "Have you seen this?" Sarah asked, her voice tense. "Yes," Lisa replied. "And we have a countermove. I've contacted a lawyer. He's ready to represent you. And also, one of the reporters wants to interview you live. This is a chance to tell what's happening here." Sarah took a deep breath. Just a few days ago, she couldn't have imagined herself at the center of such attention. But now she couldn't back down. This was about more than just her. A few hours later, a television van appeared in front of her house. The reporter, a middle-aged woman with a professional smile and focused gaze, set up the equipment. Veterans, neighbors, and even some strangers gathered in the yard. Everyone was waiting for her words. "We're live in a minute," the cameraman warned. Sarah looked at Lisa, then at Greg. They silently nodded, letting her know she wasn't alone. 3, 2, 1. Today we are at the home of Sarah King, a war veteran whose ramp was demolished by the Homeowners Association. "Sarah, how do you feel right now?" Sarah gathered her strength and began to speak. "I feel like they're trying to erase me, as if I shouldn't be here." Her voice trembled but was firm. "But I am here, and I'm not going to disappear. We built this ramp because it's necessary for my life, and I won't let them demolish it." The reporter nodded. "The HOA claims that the structure violates the neighborhood rules. What do you think about that?" "I think they're hiding behind bureaucracy," Sarah replied. "But I know that legally they have no right to do this. We have a lawyer working on it, and we will fight." The crowd behind her burst into applause. After the interview, Sarah felt a new resolve filling her body. Now that the story had spread, there was no turning back. The HOA had started a war, but she wasn't going to lose. The next morning, Sarah felt the pressure from the HOA intensifying. After the live broadcast, the situation had changed, but not for the better. Her appearance had caused a stir in society, but now the Homeowners Association was more determined than ever. In her mailbox lay a new letter, a notice of legal action. Sarah tore open the envelope, her hands trembling. The HOA was suing, demanding not only the removal of the ramp, but also the imposition of fines for the allegedly illegal construction. Greg and Lisa, seeing the expression on her face, came closer. "They're moving to the next steps," Sarah said quietly, handing Lisa the paper. "We knew they wouldn't stop," Greg replied, "but we have a lawyer. We'll put up a fight." Lisa nodded. "I've already arranged with a human rights organization. They're ready to provide support if the case goes to court, but we need to prepare." At that moment, people began to gather in front of the house again. Some of them had already become part of this struggle. Others were arriving from other cities, having heard Sarah's story. Among them were several representatives of major disability rights organizations. "Sarah," said one of them, a tall man with glasses and a folder in his hands, "I'm David Marshall, representing the Voice of Equality Foundation. We are ready to provide a lawyer and help you defend your rights in court." Sarah took a deep breath, realizing the scale her struggle had taken on. This was no longer just her personal fight against bureaucracy. It had become a precedent that could affect many people. Throughout the day, the team worked on a strategy. A group of volunteers helped to analyze accessibility laws, finding any loopholes Sarah could use. Greg coordinated protest actions to attract more public attention. Lisa communicated with the press, reporting on the developments. And in the evening, something unexpected happened. Karen Holloway, the chairwoman of the HOA, appeared in front of Sarah's house. Her eyes held no anger or triumph, only tension. "Can we talk?" she asked. Greg crossed his arms, but Sarah stopped him with a look. She nodded, inviting Karen onto the porch. "Do you really want to go this far?" Sarah asked, her voice cold. Karen sighed. "The HOA is under strong pressure because of this. Some members of the board believe it's better to settle the situation than to take it to court." Sarah frowned. Doubts filled her. Was this a trick or a genuine desire to find a compromise? "And what are you offering?" she asked cautiously. Karen pursed her lips. "You remove the ramp, but we help you find another option that complies with the rules." Sarah shook her head. That's not a solution. The ramp stays." Karen took a deep breath, her face tense. "Then we'll see you in court." She turned and left, and Sarah watched her go. She knew the next battle would be the toughest, but now she had an army of allies, and she wasn't going to back down. The day of the trial arrived. Sarah woke up earlier than usual. The whole house was filled with tense anticipation. Outside, people were already gathering: veterans, neighbors, activists, and concerned citizens. For them, this process had become more than just one woman's fight against bureaucracy. It had become a symbol of the struggle for the rights of people with disabilities. Lisa entered the room with a cup of coffee and placed a copy of the HOA's lawsuit in front of Sarah. "Are you ready?" she asked. Sarah looked at the papers. On one side were cold legal formulations. On the other was a real threat to her life and independence. She gripped the armrests of her chair tighter. "Yes, now I'm definitely ready." In the courtroom, the hall was full. On one side sat the HOA representatives in strict suits. On the other was Sarah's support group. In the front row sat David Marshall, the lawyer who had agreed to represent her interests. He confidently arranged his documents, preparing for his opening statement. The judge entered and the hall stood. After the standard procedures, the hearing began. The HOA's lawyer spoke first. He spoke confidently, with cold formality. "The HOA is acting in accordance with the charter of the residential complex. Any changes to the exterior of the buildings must be approved. In this case, the defendant installed a structure without proper authorization." Sarah listened to him and felt anger welling up inside her. For him, this was just another administrative procedure, but for her, it was a matter of life. When the floor was given to David Marshall, he paused, looking around the hall. "Your Honor, before us is not just a question of compliance with regulations. This is a question of fundamental human rights. Sarah King is a veteran who sacrificed her health for this country. Her ramp is not a decoration, it is a vital necessity. And here's what's important. Federal laws protect people like her. The Americans with Disabilities Act, ADA, explicitly states that people with disabilities have the right to access their homes. The HOA is not just violating internal regulations. They are violating federal law." Applause and murmurs of approval filled the hall. The HOA clearly did not expect such a turn of events. Next came the witness statements. Greg Parker, her neighbor, was the first to speak in Sarah's defense. "I have lived next to Sarah for several years. She honestly fought for her independence. This ramp is her only way to leave the house. When it was demolished, it was not just the destruction of a structure, it was the destruction of her freedom." Then several veterans took the stand. One of them, a man in his 50s with a cane, spoke particularly emotionally. "If the HOA wins today, what will happen tomorrow? Will we, the disabled, the veterans, become hostages of bureaucracy? Will they lock us in our homes so we don't disturb their perfect neighborhood image? We won't allow it." When the judge asked Sarah to speak, she straightened in her chair and looked straight ahead. "I am not seeking conflict. I just want to live like everyone else. I want to go to the store, walk my dog, go out. This is not a luxury. This is a right, and I will not let anyone take it away from me." The HOA tried to counter, but their arguments seemed weaker with each statement. Lawyer David Marshall bolstered his position with references to legal precedents confirming the legality of Sarah's demands. After several hours of hearings, the judge retired to make a decision. Tension filled the hall. 20 minutes later, he returned. "The court has considered all the arguments and rules in favor of the defendant, Sarah King. The HOA is ordered to immediately cease any attempts to demolish the structure and pay compensation for the damage caused." The hall erupted in applause. Sarah closed her eyes and exhaled. She had won. But she knew that this was not just her victory. It was a step towards change for all people in the same situation. The court's decision in Sarah's favor became a turning point, but the struggle was not over. Soon after her victory, her story spread through the media, attracting the attention of not only local, but also national human rights organizations. Many people with disabilities began writing to her, sharing their stories of injustice. Veterans, activists, lawyers, and even politicians began discussing the need for reforms in accessibility laws. Sarah unexpectedly found herself at the center of a movement that went far beyond her personal struggle. Lisa entered the house holding a printed document. "Look at this," she said, handing the papers to Sarah. "One of the senators wants to meet with you. They are considering amendments to the accessibility law. Sarah quickly scanned the text. Her heart tightened, not from fear, but from the realization of the scale her struggle had taken on. "Do you think I should agree?" she asked. Lisa smiled. "Are you serious? Sarah, you have inspired people across the country. If anyone should speak about this, it's you." Meanwhile, the situation in her neighborhood had also changed. The HOA, having lost the lawsuit, found themselves under public pressure. Some members of the board resigned, and new people came in, ready to revise the association's policies. For the first time in a long time, Sarah felt that her home truly belonged to her. The next day, she stood by her ramp, watching as neighbors passed by. Many of them, who had previously kept their distance, now greeted her, and some even stopped to say, "Thank you for not giving up." "I just wanted to live in peace," Sarah said, stroking her dog Marley. "But maybe sometimes peace can only be found after a fight." A few weeks later, she found herself in a conference room, speaking before a committee considering changes to accessibility legislation. She looked at the senators and officials and felt her voice tremble, but she couldn't remain silent. "The issue is not about giving us special conditions," she said. "The issue is about giving us the opportunity to live with dignity. We don't need handouts. We need respect. And if this bill can help even one person avoid what I went through, then it's worth it." The applause that filled the hall echoed in her heart. She knew this was not the end, but the beginning of something bigger. She was ready to move forward. Several months had passed since Sarah won the lawsuit. Her life had changed, but not in the way she had expected. Now she was not just living her life. She had become a symbol of resistance, the voice of those who were not heard. Sitting on her porch, Sarah looked out at the street. Neighbors who had once avoided her gaze now greeted her with respect. The HOA no longer tried to dictate the rules. Her new ramp remained in place. Moreover, the association began implementing changes to create a more accessible environment for people with disabilities. Her phone rang. It was Lisa. "Are you ready?" she asked. Sarah smiled. "I think so." Today she was to speak at a major conference on the rights of people with disabilities, where she had been invited as an honorary guest. She had never sought fame, but now she understood. Her story could inspire others. Before leaving the house, she paused at the ramp. Marley sat next to her, wagging his tail. Sarah leaned down and patted his head. "We did it, buddy," she whispered. At the conference, she was greeted with applause. She spoke before hundreds of people sharing her story, a story not of a victim, but of a person who refused to give up. In the hall sat veterans, activists, politicians, people whose lives could change thanks to her struggle. After the speech, an elderly man in a wheelchair approached her. His eyes shone with gratitude. "Thank you, Ms. King," he said. "You gave us hope." Sarah smiled. That was all she needed to hear. Outside, her friends were waiting for her. Lisa, Greg, and others. They were no longer just a group of people who happened to be together in a difficult moment. They had become a family, united by a common struggle. When Sarah looked up at the sky, she felt that she had done something important. She had changed not only her own life, but the lives of many others. And that meant the struggle was worth it.